Hi there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, friends and enemies, and everyone else in between. I'm John, motherfucking Willie, and I'm just sending a shout out to you and everyone listening. Just want to maybe take a few seconds to sort of try and explain what it is that I'm doing here, what Circle 8 means, and yet I know that I can't really explain anything when I'm trying to. I know that it's only when I'm sort of backing off and relaxing, almost forgetting what I'm doing, that I sort of accidentally, it seems, circle back and almost inexplicably, indirectly end up saying exactly what I meant to say. And so, if you'll forgive me, I just need a few moments to lose myself. And so the best way to lose myself is just sort of to simply talk without thinking about where I'm going. And in fact, that does have a lot to do with what Circle 8 means to me. You know, there's a sense in which I am operating in a way that prefers to be distracted. I'm moving in a way that a friend of mine once called orthogonal, which is just a fancy way of saying nonlinear, which is an even fancier way of saying some people enjoy losing themselves. And in fact, when you listen to people who are talking or people who are exclaiming, you find that they are often making almost no logical sense. In fact, there's very rarely any logical consistency between one idea and another. And so I don't expect that much from myself. I find that when I allow myself to simply unfold, to simply say whatever I'm thinking, that things end up working out. It's almost as if we didn't need to think at all in order to think. It's almost as if thinking were perhaps something else altogether, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. You know, I intended on speaking very generally about what it is that I'm doing, with this YouTube channel and what I intend on doing with these podcasts that I'm sort of putting together, like The Waking Mess, which is a podcast about philosophy and life, and another one called The Royal Lowdown, which is sort of an investigation of so-called taboo subjects. But a lot of it begins here. And by here, I mean in this apartment, in this space, in this body, on this earth, within this atmosphere that is a sort of expression of Earth, you know, in the sense in which our world externalizes itself in everything we see. And so if you're looking for an inner landscape, you only have to open your eyes. Sorry for getting carried away, but those kind of performative utterances are something I take a lot of pleasure in, especially if I'm not even understanding correctly the very words and concepts that I'm using. But once again, I'm not going to apologize for being lost, because I sort of suspect that you yourself are even more lost if you don't know than you are aware of. In fact, I think we're all sort of lost, and yet there are sort of flashes of lightning amidst the darkness. You know, there's, in many ways, there are things that stand out that can sort of guide us. There's just a sense in which we can perhaps tell the difference between the superficial and the substantial, and then in knowing so, we have a kind of guidance, or we might pivot and maybe suggest a different idea, which is that we're guided by pleasure and we're avoiding pain. And if that's the case, what I'm doing here is motivated purely by pleasure. The pleasure of the speculative, the pleasure of circulating, the pleasure of discovering within myself not a dichotomy, but a kind of dialectic, you might say, a recovery of the dialectic. And that very idea plays a large part in Circle 8 and in everything else I do. But I do tend to get carried away with myself and know for a fact that the only way to begin is to start with basics and a prayer, you know, a secular prayer, which is, please God, let this microphone work and don't let there be a hissing. And please God, let this Tascam do what it's supposed to do in this webcam video, and let it operate in such a way that it can remember itself. You know, I'm sort of relying on that possibility. But I had originally meant to speak only about the basics, to talk about the fundamentals, you know. That's really what I want to ground this in what I mean by this is this sort of ongoing exploration of the specificity of my own life. And there's a sense in which language can only operate often enough in a general sense. So I'm moving from the specific to the general. You might say that I'm circulating between the biggest ideas and the smallest notions. And believe it or not, I prefer the smallest amongst the. I prefer the most specific among the specifics. I prefer the singularity of individual everyday people, not to poeticize them by any means, and not to be sentimental. That has nothing to do with this, nor am I ethical or morally minded. What I am in many ways is someone that sort of sincerely enjoys thinking in ways that aren't so serious all the time. But there is, in fact, an urgency, I think, behind what every thinking person is doing, so long as they're thinking. And that urgency is many things. It could be the very pain of your life that is orienting you to think in a critical, constructive way about what you can do with the resources and possibilities that you have to make the most out of what you have. But it could mean beginning with the joy that one discovers in the kind of ways in which things are concealing and revealing themselves. And there's a sort of pleasure that comes with revealing yourself to yourself through the activity of speaking, through the activity of conversing with another, or even just reading a book or reading a poem or looking at a really great film. So there's a sense in which I want to animate what is often overlooked as being superfluous. In fact, we live in a society, at least if you live where I do, that is heavily driven by managerial notions, which is, I hate to say it, but another fancy way of saying that we live in a society dominated by ideas that think of thinking and philosophy and art and culture itself ultimately as being ultimately irrelevant or pointless or needless. And in a certain sense, yeah, most of the art world is fucking bullshit. And most of what counts as philosophy is nonsensical. So there is a sense in which Americans, especially in the Midwest, are right to just love sports or to love their cars or to love making money. I mean, all of that certainly is to be celebrated and honored. But there's a sense in which one cannot help but notice that there's something missing. And one cannot accuse another of missing something because one doesn't have access to their minds. In fact, they might not have access to their own minds. That's sort of a philosophical point. But the real point that I mean to make is that one can only affirm what one is. And I am someone that has had to fight against the grain in order to bring myself to where I am. And of course, I've been helped hand in hand by many others who have made me what I am. And so there's a sense in which I'm lucky enough and privileged enough to be here where I am. But there's a deeper sense in which one has to simply assert their authority. That is, there's an underlying sense in which one becomes an author, one becomes a voice simply by taking the authority. In fact, all authority is arbitrary. It's very rarely, if not ever, never grounded in rationality. You know, the authority to make a channel, a YouTube channel, to create a YouTube video, that in itself requires a kind of courage to say that I have something to say. And in many ways, many people have nothing to say. And it's troubling when they don't seem to recognize that they have little to say. But what's even more troubling is that many people do have quite a bit to say and don't realize it. And I don't know if I do, but I sure as hell hope to find out whether or not I do in the course of making these videos. And so I'm here at this point where I have to be honest that it's weird to be recording videos. It's weird to be making myself known, to be so lacking in humility as to assume that I should have a spotlight on me, that, you know, I should have a stage. You know, it's weird, but there is a sense in which what I have been doing within myself for as long as I have, and with everything that I have discovered, I think that there is a sense in which there's no choice except to affirm myself and to affirm what I have to say. And in much of that is writing. And what I mean to say about finding it weird to be on video is that I identify as someone who writes, and although I failed at that, in fact, I failed so bad as a writer that I'm not even a failed writer. That is to be published and then to fail. I'm yet to even be published. So I'm at that beginning part of my own journey where I'm wanting to put writing out there and I'm hoping to get essays and poems published. And it's really a leap, given that I've kept this all to myself. And in many ways, it's something that I've really believed in. And if I don't sort of take that leap now, it won't really happen. And I won't be able to make that leap if I'm not really getting the kind of feedback that I can get by putting my voice out there on YouTube, the kind of feedback that I might get from my family who might be watching these videos, I hope, who can tell me things that can help me improve what I'm doing. But ultimately, I hope to get feedback by conveying the kind of ideas and propositions and language and style and direction and themes and values that I'm ultimately exploring in my writing. In fact, there's a lot of specific things that I hope to bring out in a way that only I can and get response in a way that only you as a listener, as a potential reader, can give me. And so I'm going to do a lot of things on this channel. I'm going to be offering things that are like practical, but also saying a lot of things that are nonsensical and theoretical, because I'm deeply philosophical, but philosophy for me has never been that far away from poetry. And although I don't associate the two, I don't think that art and politics and philosophy are the same thing. In fact, I'm a little bit more conservative, you might say, or classically minded in respect to that. But there is a sense in which I think that philosophers have to go to school with the musicians, as it said. And there's a sense in which what I'm doing here is not merely speaking, but partially singing. And there's a sense in which what one does when one writes poetry is to exist in a space that's somewhere between normal everyday speech and song. And so there's a sense in which I'm wanting to ride on the harmonies between all of that and practice the kind of myriad of forms that take the literal form of different voices or different ways of creating content. And so you'll find that I often, in many ways, at least I think that I say stupid things. And I don't mean that I'm being self-deferential or negative or anything, but I often, like Michael Scott said on The Office, I often start a sentence and then I sort of pray that it'll find a conclusion. But a part of the joy, I think, in speaking, as in writing, is that you often end up saying things that are completely stupid and completely ridiculous. And the thing about writing is that you can go back and delete it. You can edit your writing, and there's a profound control that one has over what one says when you're writing, given that you can change it, edit it, fix it. But there's a sense in which when you speak, you're granted none of that control, and you'll find that I will say many things that if they were in writing, I definitely would edit them or delete them out. But I'm taking a risk, the kind of risk that a lot of writers don't like, or people that are focused on content and prefer to elevate their content by speaking in a way that gives as much as it can. There's a sense in which you can never speak at all. And so I found that there's been a great divide in many ways in my life between my conversational skills and my public life and my writing. And I never would have thought it would get to the point where it is now, where there's such a great gulf between the two. And that's about as much as I can say about that, except that I plan on fighting to bring those worlds together, so that I can become as sharp as possible. And so I'm really just sort of recording this message right now as an attempt to see what I look like and what I sound like with the setup that I have. But maybe I can leave this here as a sort of record for where I'm at, and having set up this channel and simply uploaded a few videos that are like fitness oriented. But I'm hoping to record a lot more videos regarding philosophy, regarding everything in between that and literature and poetry and life. I guess you'll just have to see, because it'll be one step at a time. And so I hope to surprise myself along the ways, and I hope to also, turn this into something that is bigger than its parts. So I appreciate you all for listening. Thank you so much. I'm John Edward Willie, signing off.